Along the entire 2,000-mile U.S.-Mexico border, there's 299 miles of vehicle barrier and 350 miles of pedestrian fencing. Vehicle barrier appears in yellow and pedestrian fencing in red here on this interactive map from USA Today, where they follow the entire path of the border wall in a helicopter, allowing you to zoom in on any portion of it. Just past El Paso, the border wall stops entirely and then picks up again along this stretch of the lower Rio Grande Valley. And it's in this stretch where I recently visited several locations along the proposed path of the wall. And I began at the National Butterfly Center, home to over 200 species of butterflies and a rare remaining stop on the migration of the monarch. Where next to the tally of current butterfly populations is a list of the laws that had to be waived in order for the border wall to cut the property in half. Because this is the property of the National Butterfly Center along the international boundary in the Rio Grande River, and this is the proposed path of the border wall that would cut it in half. Because the Rio Grande tends to flood and meander, the current construction of the border wall is going along a road on a levee, up to a mile away from the international border. Acting as a critical habitat and migration route for so many species, the natural beauty of the National Butterfly Center is now cast in an ominous tone that you can hear from a distance. Because this conservatory, along with a 300-foot wide swath of ecosystem along the entire proposed route of the wall, would be seized by eminent domain and plowed flat. This is the conservatory on the left, the place where I had been making videos of birds on the right. This is the path of the proposed border wall along the levee, and this is the area seized by eminent domain. Remember the ominous tone I mentioned? Here we are again on the Levee Road in the Butterfly Center, the proposed path of the wall, looking south over the vegetation that they wouldn't be able to maintain to attract butterflies, and the wetland that they wouldn't be able to maintain to attract waterfowl and wildlife. But the border wall would cut off even more than that. Imagine if no one in America ever again had access to the entire extent of the Rio Grande River. But the situation is even more complicated because there are lots of people, like this community around La Alameda Mission, who live in between the international boundary and the proposed path of the wall. Just like this community along the Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge. And in the little community, there's an old Methodist church with a cemetery in the yard that includes Confederate soldiers of the Civil War buried next to World War II veterans. And a few blocks away, there's another cemetery where other families are buried and other war veterans, whose family lineages stretch back since before Texas was a state and before America was a country. And the backdrop of this cemetery is the Levee Road that is the foundation for the proposed border wall. Here's what that community looks like, and the cemetery we just visited, and the one we visited before that. Here's the path of the proposed wall, the extent of what would be seized under eminent domain, and the portion that would be bulldozed flat. This yellow line is the Rio Grande River and the international border. Up on the top left is the Butterfly Center where we began. Down on the lower right is the community we just saw. And this is the path of the wall, functionally excluding from America indigenous people, Texan communities, all the wildlife habitat, and the Rio Grande River. Yesterday, Customs and Border Patrol announced that in February of 2019, there were 66,000 apprehensions of people crossing illegally from Mexico into the United States. Of them, 70% were from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, and 65% were families and unaccompanied children. Whereas about 10 years ago, 7% were from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, because about 90% of them were Mexican nationals, and about 85% of them were men. Even though the annual number of apprehensions is near a 50-year low, and the number of Border Patrol agents is near a record high, the issue is that the Customs and Border Patrol is well equipped to detain and quickly deport Mexican men. But the Border Patrol facilities are not set up to hold this kind of influx of families and unaccompanied children. The problem is that Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador are no longer set up to hold families either.